University, and I primarily teach in user experience design, undergraduate and graduate. And I do research in ethics, policy, and justice in technology development and research, particularly in the space of disability. Sorry, I've clicked a button and it wasn't good enough. You could trim that. There you go. Okay, so the overview of the talk today, I guess the title, this is a little bit cheeky. So the title is, this is an intervention, and a lot of my work critiques the way that we focus on intervention and disability. So this is me flipping that, and that's my joke. So the overview, I'm going to do a really brief sort of discussion of human-computer interaction as a field and its relation to disability. I'm going to talk about grassroots justice movements and how they apply to human-computer interaction. And I'm going to discuss common pitfalls, even as we try to apply some of these justice frameworks. I see some mistakes that people will make. And then I'm going to talk about some transformative approaches that I think help keep people humble when they are trying to do this work. I have other work where I detail, like even with specific dates, like the trends in research on disability and HCI, but I think it's a little bit dry and I'm not going to do it. But writ large, the research on disability in HCI, and when I say HCI, I mean broadly like the ACM and IEEE. Disability is a context for the technofix, and I draw from Ruha Benjamin's work on the technofix in race critical code studies, that this is an exciting space for people to go and work in and feel like they're solving a problem. But the problem is that they're localizing the problem inside a body of a person, instead of actually recognizing larger social structures that produce difficulties for disabled people. And so what we have is this viewpoint that assistive technology is actually something curative or normalizing. And I draw on bioethicist Joe Stramondo's work in this area, where he discusses like the distinction between technology that's actually meant to be useful to the disabled person and technology that's meant to make the disabled person invisible or indistinguishable from their peers. And so there have been some challenges in HCI to this work, and not just the two listed here. There have been many, and I'll talk about some more of them later. But the very first instance that we really have is critical disability studies in HCI. It's actually disability studies as a critical frame for, the title is longer, and it's by Mankoff, Hayes, and Kasnitz. And Kasnitz is actually, Deva Kasnitz is actually an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist of disability, who's one of the founding members of the Society for Disability Studies. In 2019, I myself, and tacking on my advisor, wrote the Cyborg Perspectives paper, which I think might have been one that I shared with you all. But also colleagues and I have written other pieces that are a bit more like personal storytelling, in the sense of like the epistemic violence paper that a lot of people know about, and so on. Also work by Daniela Rosner and Cynthia Bennett, which I will talk about later. There was also a piece for interactions that I worked on with several different people. I deliberately chose people that I don't traditionally work with. And in this paper, I talk about how there is some articulation work to be done for researchers in disability and HCI, where if they could spend more time being humble and thoughtful about how they interface with and articulate within, and maybe even in some cases are actually a member of disabled community, that their perceptions about what the solution to problems are will fundamentally change. So the Allied Media Conference and the Design Justice Network came up with a set of design justice principles, which I think many critical HCI people are aware of. And I have seen these taken up as sort of a guidepost for people who are trying to do ethical justice work in HCI. These are sort of community-centered drivers for technology design. And not really just technology design, they're really thinking broadly, even like into civic engineering. And so to briefly go over these 10 principles, they talk about that design should be about sustaining, healing, and empowering communities, and that you should be centering the voices of the most directly impacted, and that the community impact is more important than the design intent. And this one is really big because a lot of times when we critique designs, people get in their feelings about, but I was trying to do good things. And that's fine and good. But if you want to do good things, then you should want to hear that that it didn't work, and that you need to try again. And that the change emerges from accountability and a collaboration. So a lot of these principles are tying into broader narratives of critique and pushback against critique. So when marginalized people try to say, hey, that actually hurt us, instead of getting like an acknowledgement of that and like a commitment to doing better, we get a lot of dismissal and like that you're just not being grateful, right? And so we also want to look at the designer as a facilitator. Now, this gets a little bit tricky because especially when you're teaching designers, because designers want to believe that by the end of their degree, they're going to be experts or good at design, right? Which is like their dream. And that is not necessarily untrue, right? But the truth is that expert designers and people who design well are constantly in this practice of humility and reflection and engagement with the communities they're working with. And so it's really hard to get students often to understand that the goal is actually not for you to be a star designer. The goal is honestly for people to have no idea that you worked on the project. Or to understand your work on that project as a core facilitation. And just in general, respecting the lived expertise and the knowledge that comes out of communities that we're working with, and that these solutions should be non-exploitative, and that we should be focusing on assets of the community and what's already working. And then this especially is important, this sustainable aspect of this, and that's not just in the sense of ecological sustainability, but yes, it is also that. But it's also in the sense that a lot of times in these projects that we have grants for, we do this work with an oppressed community, and then the money is over and our papers are published and we leave, and whatever it is that we built together doesn't actually live beyond after that pullout. And that's a big problem. Similarly, a group called Sins Invalid out of the Bay Area has 10 principles of disability justice. And Sins Invalid is a performance troupe that does sort of like activism around cultural production by disabled people and challenging the idea that disabled people don't belong in public spaces and don't belong in culture. And so they do a lot of performance where they center the fact that the performance is accessible in multiple modes. So everything from the performers on stage are often using wheelchairs and can get around on those wheelchairs without having to be lifted or carried, or they can be carried when that's actually the point of the piece sometimes. But there's also like sign language and captioning and other forms of access centered in those performances. But what they found is that in the relationships they had to build to make these performances happen, they were actually pointing towards a broader social transformation and relationality between disabled people and between other people. So they realized that in order to actually do disability justice, they had to center intersectionality. And this comes into the fact that a lot of disability rights movement is very white-led and white-centered. And a lot of white disability rights activists will quite literally throw Black disabled people and especially cognitively disabled people under the bus in order to get their new rights. And again, just like design justice, they talk about leadership of the most impacted. There's also an anti-capitalist politic, which I always enjoy saying to academics because I like to watch them squirm about it. And then there's a commitment to cross-movement organizing. And this is, we bring our whole selves into a space, and there's never just the aspect of me that is disabled. There are other issues that cross-cut with other movements. And that comes to recognizing wholeness. And again, they also talk about sustainability, and they do mean it in both the senses of ecologically and also personally, that there is activist burnout and that their movement should not produce that. In all of these, I think the most important to my mind for HCI researchers to really understand is this leadership of the most impacted and these commitments to cross disability and cross movement organizing and sustainability. So the challenges I have, these are not critiques of the principles or of the organizations and collectives that have made them. These are critiques to how they get taken up, especially in the academy. So, you know, who decides what is healing and who defines empowerment? Who is most directly impacted? And what if an indirect impact is actually more dangerous? Then who decides what is already working? And so essentially, you know, who is in charge? And here I have a quote from Roland Johnson, who was a Black cognitively disabled man who escaped institutionalization at Pennhurst and devoted his life to activism in bringing sort of political awareness and like radical desires for escaping the institution to his peers. And so the quote from Roland is, I want to know, raising hands, who are in control? Are you in control? Are staff in control? Who's in charge over you? Are you in charge? And so what he's pointing to here is that even when we broke out of institutions, we then were placed in smaller settings, in group homes, and in these spaces, we actually still have a lot of power over disabled people. And the same thing happens in activism and in things like inclusive and participatory design, where we believe we are talking to our primary stakeholders, but those stakeholders have power over other people. And so some of the practices that you might be really familiar with in UX and HCI are personas, journey mapping, and stakeholder interviews. Now, I'm definitely not saying don't interview people. That's ridiculous. But I am saying that oftentimes when you take a stakeholder group that you've been handed and run with it, you maybe have forgotten to analyze sort of where those stakeholders are positioned in a broader network of social power. And this is especially true in disability when we tend to interview caregivers and parents or therapists and teachers. And we make a lot of excuses about why we can't interview the disabled people themselves. Or that only certain kinds of disabled people are capable of being interviewed. Sometimes I see when my students do journey mapping that they are inadvertently making assumptions about the cognitive processes and the motivations behind the actions that they are observing and putting into the map. And so this comes to practices of validation and reflection, like your participants should know what kinds of interpretations you're making from them as data and be able to tell you whether or not you're on the right track. And in general, actually in my program, we tell them not to do personas. Like you can make a persona for the purpose of like telling a story, but if you're designing based on a persona, you're very often sort of trying to condense a lot of very rich information into tropes. And then those tropes become distracting. And you start designing for a trope rather than a whole person. And I'm not the only one to critique these practices. Actually, Bennett and Rosner did a very good job of this in 2019 at Kai with their Against Empathy paper, like on the promise of empathy and knowing the other. And they talk about when you're thinking about design work for underrepresented or marginalized groups, so you need to be thinking about being with them rather than being like them. Trying to put yourself in the shoes of others is just like not actually an appropriate approach, because it never really quite works out. And we could go all the way into phenomenology of like, what does it mean to be a bat? Like we can go really deep here about how you just are never actually going to get this right. And so being in good relation with people is actually much more effective for design processes. And so I mentioned the stakeholder issue. And so there's this thing I call the stakeholder trap. where you're given an impression that your stakeholders are. This happens in business much really concretely. They'll be like, these are your stakeholder groups. And this happens in research also, when your advisor says, I'm doing a project on this and these are the participants that we have. But have you investigated where those people lie within broader networks of social power? And if you're doing participatory research, but you're doing it with parents, it's not that the parents don't have very essential insights into the lives and needs of their children. It's that socially and culturally they have power over their children, and you don't get an accurate investigation into sort of upturning what are the normalizing assumptions that parents are living with internalized ableism and internalized biases about what they should want for their children, and without exploring the dynamics there, then you miss crucial aspects of what it means to be and to grow up as a disabled child. And I keep talking about disabled children as an example because I think it's well documented in the literature that we don't do a good job of participating with disabled children. And it's also really like natural for us to think, oh, but the parents can tell us. And now I'm not saying this to make you suspicious of any of your participants, but disabled children have much higher rates of being abused. So broadly, systemically, the issue of parenting disabled children has problems. And I say this as a parent of disabled children. And so these principles that I am discussing next are from a chapter that I wrote on transforming participatory ethics in human systems engineering. But these are the ways that I attempt to advise people to practice reflection and humility in the context of trying to do justice work, in the context of trying to do good participatory design, and that you must attend to the power. And so if we want to think about the most impacted, you're going to have to navigate through this social network of power to find where's the disparity between who you're told is your focus user group and who actually gets impacted by the use of that product. I would also like to point out that this is very true in nonprofit spaces. A lot of times we are told that we are collaborating with the community when we are working with a nonprofit, and that's not untrue, but nonprofits are very often in a very strict paternalistic power over very abject, like marginalized group of people. And so it's very important to think about how that relationship plays out in the lives of the constituents of the nonprofit, for example, or who the nonprofit claims to be representing. And so I want to talk a little bit about voice here, and we have a tendency to think about work as like giving voice to the voiceless, but there's no such thing. Everyone has a voice. It's just that some people are quite literally not being listened to or ignored or actively silenced. And we do this in the lab, actually, with disabled children when we focus on a single mode of data. And when you're talking about children with complex communication needs and you're only listening to audio transcripts for coding, you get a totally different story than if you were to actually watch the video, or to like be in the moment observing. My favorite paper on this is actually a paper by Dindar and colleagues that talks about the construction of communicative incompetence. And they talk about how the way that you analyze and code the video transcript versus the audio transcript versus both tells a totally different story about the child. And the child is labeled as defiant or non-compliant or even just non-helpful or non-cooperative until you get the video and the audio together and realize that the child is actually helping the researcher because the computer is malfunctioning and the child is actually helping. And you don't get that from one mode of one data channel. You have to use both. And so another thing that we do in the lab and in interviews is this is what Margaret Price calls a kairotic space. And kairotic comes from the term kairos and time. And so these are high stakes environments where this real-time unfolding of events occurs, and anybody who has non-normative communication or any sort of social factors that may lead them to resistance, or fear or hesitation, they get overwritten in these spaces. And so you have to be attentive to what are the particular needs for communication of your population. So sometimes actually, I interview autistic adults over text message. I have to fight with my IRB sometimes about how, yes, that's allowed, and I use like Signal, so I can be like, it's encrypted. But they like get confused about it, and I'm like, no, like I can get rich ethnographic data from a week of talking to somebody over text chat that I cannot get from an hour of making somebody sit in front of a camera and talk to me. And so these kinds of complex explorations into what is effective communication for your population is a really important aspect to consider when you're doing this kind of work. And then I've mentioned humility many times, and I don't really have any cute bullet points for it. But essentially, you have to recognize that you don't know things. You certainly don't know what the solution is, because most of you don't even know what the problem is. And to just be humble in that and be like excited about being wrong. And so we're at 10:30, but I know we started a little bit late. And so I just wanted to check in because we do not have to keep going, and I can be done. Because my Q&A is my favorite part.
Please keep going.
Okay. So these next few slides are from work that has not been published yet and has been projected for the past year and a half. If any of you happen to review this work, thank you, actually, because I have a really good opportunity to make it better now. And so anyway, I just wanted to say that because in HCI, we tend to not present work we haven't published, but in humanities, we do it all the time. And I'm both, and so it's complex. So another approach that I'm working on is called Counterventions in human-computer interaction. And this is an explicit attempt to bring these critiques of method into practice, where you have someone who is sort of invested in the interventionist model of human-computer interaction and wants to change. How do you practice change? So I'm very interested in some of my broader ethics work on the actual transformation of researchers, because we have entire fields devoted to critiquing, the norm. We have science and technology studies, and we have disability studies, and we have feminist technoscience, and these are all very important fields that I myself am published and involved in, but like our very cool writing doesn't actually make researchers do different things. So I'm really interested in how to make people change. And I say make change. The people have to want to change, but actually a surprising number of them want to do better. They just have no idea what they're doing. And so I've developed this sort of concept of a countervention as doing the practices of designing an intervention in a way that's critical of itself. And in so doing, what I find is that the intervention then comes from, instead of like researchers intervening on, in this case, autistic children, the autistic children intervene on the researchers. And so the directionality of this like intervention and like transformation of worldview happens this way rather than towards the subject or the object, depending on, anyway. So the countervention has sort of these 5 guidelines, and I really hate, got fought about it in my dissertation that I had to make guidelines because I don't actually like them, because as you saw with the principles, which again, I really appreciate the principles and I'm not critiquing the principles, but when you make lists, people in academia like to take the lists and treat them as checklists and say, oh, I did the thing, so now this product is good. And that is not what I mean. So anyway, when I say I have 5 guidelines, I really don't think about them so concretely. Like these are just like 5 ways of making a very short sentence about what you should be doing in order to change your outlook. So we talk about reflexive engagement. And what I mean here in detail is that when you are doing participatory interview work, that you're really thinking about what is the person saying, and that you are reflecting back to them what they've said to make sure that you interpreted it correctly. But also, I get challenged on this a little bit, and I understand why. People will tell you stuff that is based in their own oppression. They will tell you that they want things that are based in how the world has brought them up hating themselves. And it is not necessarily your job to like tell them that, or that even many of you may not even have the expertise to know that, but to know that that is a possibility, and that there are other forms of expertise that you should be combining with your participants, like the cultural writings of other people in that group, and the outlooks of activists in that group, to contextualize the stories that you're being told by your participants. Because I've seen a number of participatory studies, particularly actually in like women's HCI and women's health, where they'll take something that the person said where they're causing epistemic harm to themselves. They have a very negative outlook on their own self that was given to them by society, and they're repeating it back to you as a desire. And so I get pushback on this because people are like, well, who are you to say, what somebody really wants? And I appreciate that, and I want to continue to be challenged in that way, but there has to be a balance between taking what somebody says at face value and understanding that some of it is actually rooted in very real forms of social harm. And so when I talk about critical disconnects, I mean the disconnects between what academic literature says about a group and what they say about themselves. And this is very stark in the autistic community, as far as we have like 90% of interventions are focused on social skills. And like autistic people will tell you all day, every day, that actually the inability to fill out a form because it's too emotionally exhausting is way more like troublesome to me than social interactions. And the interrogation of power comes back to that stakeholder trap that I discussed, but it's not just within the social context of your participants, but also within yourself, to understand yourself as always, even as a marginalized researcher yourself, researching your own community, you have privileges over them that they don't have, and that you may be enacting power in ways that you're not intending to do. And that when you're building this intervention, it's meant to be a critique. You're meant to sort of parody yourself. You're meant to sort of have fun with it and like poke holes in the things that you've been taught as like best practice or naturally good. And then when you actually run a study with this intervention, this countervention, that you do mix methods because many interventionist papers are in quantitative results, that you look at how the participant testimonies actually recontextualize the quantitative data that you get. And help you understand the issues better. And I would love to give examples of that in the Q&A because I can. And so just to put it out there, because I did a terrible job of this in the paper and I can't wait to fix it. The purpose of a countervention is to produce transformation within HCI labs through applied critical theory and research practice informed by grassroots justice movements. This is obviously, the lab has to want it, but I think a lot of them do. Here's a list of disabled makers that you can look up because they're super cool. We got Hell on Wheels Design. They make really punk mobility equipment. EDS splints. So a lot of people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome have these hyperlax joints, and there really aren't a lot of good adaptive equipments to support them. And so people are making splints with metalworking and making these really beautiful like pieces of jewelry that people get to wear and protect their joints at the same time as like feeling really stylish. Engineering at Home is another group where they talk about making your house accessible to you. Zabretta Makes It Work is a really wonderful person who is sort of dealing with the complex situation of having lots of adaptive equipment that actually sustains your life, and it constantly breaks down. And how do you fix it without having to wait 3 weeks and a time window between 8 and 6 p.m. about when somebody's going to come and fix the thing that's literally keeping you alive. And then as from an academic standpoint, Karen Nakamura's Disability Lab at Berkeley is fantastic. And that is it. And I can't wait for questions. Thank you, smiley face. the captions actually put us